Chapter 4 Echo of Inferno. Agramata of the dark flame approached the surface of the planet. The flight speed increased, and thin air at a height of hundreds of kilometers roared deafeningly behind the invulnerable walls of the ship, reliably protected from overheating and from any radiation. This sound of monstrous power was detected by Tormance sound probes. It turned out that here they had instruments that recorded the sound chronicle of the sky. Amplifiers brought this monotonous cry, sharp as a distress signal, to the offices of scientific observers, to the high towers of the Sky Guard, and to the spacious apartments of the rulers, announcing the approach of an uninvited guest, terrifying and enthralling. The starship technicians worked tirelessly, calculating programs and laying them in blunt-faced, three-eyed strike rockets. Soon, bundles of spiral tubes sheathed in 5-meter fish-shaped shells broke away from the ship, described huge parabolas, and touched the surface of the planet in predetermined places. One struck the waves of the ocean, another flashed through its depths, a third carved into the expanse of a river, while the ones that followed plowed through fields, rivers, and green areas in those spots authorized by the Tormanzians. And, having again risen to the height of the overflight, the rockets stuck to the sides of the dark flame, carrying biological samples of water, earth, and air from the alien planet for her laboratories. It was the third day that Neahali, Iviza-Tanit, and Tiviza-Haniko had not closed their eyes. Under the dull song of ultracentrifuges, they never left the proton microscopes and thermostats with countless series of bacterial and viral cultures. Analytical comparators compared the toxins of the harmful microbes of Earth and Tormance and derived long formulas of immunological reactions to neutralize hitherto unknown pathogenic principles. Immunization was given equally to those intended for landing and those remaining on the ship. The entire crew consisted of heavily breathing people with flaming faces and a feverish gleam in their eyes. Torlik and Mentikor even had to plunge into a hypnotic sleep, since the reaction force of the body required the exclusion of all activities. Nevertheless, a few days later, Iviza-Tanit announced that she was unhappy with the results and could not guarantee full-fledged protection. "What is the deadline for achieving full-fledgedness?" Rodis asked her. A little embarrassed, Iviza sunk into thought over it. "I expected to find a regular complex here. After all, the Tormanzians brought from the earth in their intestines the very same bacterial flora, without which we also cannot exist. If they were not destroyed by local microbes, but, on the contrary, flourished, this means that Earth's bacteria and viruses quelled the primitive microworld of Tormance. However, 2 unusual pathogenic viruses have been discovered. They could arise only in conditions of extreme crowding. Now we see nothing of the sort on Tormance. This is an indirect confirmation of the past overpopulation of the planet," said Rodis, "but we need to get down to Tormance as soon as possible. The necessary restructuring of our defense reactions is unlikely to take less than 2 months," said Iviza-Tanit in a tone as if it were she who was to blame for the inability to immunize sooner. Rodis smiled at her. "What to do? One would prefer to be a fully entitled guest of a new land, but it almost never happens this way. Always some circumstances take place that require haste, and do not allow you to wait. Many have spoken of the unforgettable feeling of meeting a new and safe planet. Leaving the ship in the cleanest air, under a new sun and, like a child, running through the tender virgin soil. The fierce desire to lose clothes and immerse one's whole being in the freshness of a crystal-clear world. So that bare feet walk on soft grass, so that the wind and the sun, touching bare skin, convey to it all the notes of the changing breath of nature. And so few of the hundreds of thousands of travelers to other worlds have ever got to experience it." "So, suits?" asked Neahali. "Yes, regrettable as it may be. Later, when the immunization ends, we will remove them. Without helmets, only with biofilters. And this is good fortune. But we will be ready in 3 or 4 days." "Maybe it's for the best," said Neahali. Analysis of the water of Tormance showed some structural differences from that of Earth. "At first, everyone will be weakened in acclimatizing to the new water." "Is the kind of water really important?" asked Rodis. "Sorry, I know so little. If the water is clean and free from harmful impurities, we will forgive the historian for an ancient error," Iviza smiled. "For a long time, our ancestors considered water simply water, a combination of hydrogen and oxygen, and did not know how to analyze it at all. It turned out that water has a complex physico-chemical structure with the participation of many elements. Thousands of types of water, useful, harmful, neutral, although in a simple analysis the same and completely clean, are found in the keys, rivers, and lakes of Earth. Tormance is another planet, with a different nature of the general water cycle, erosion, and mineral saturation. We found that this water, on average, can affect us with some inhibition of the nervous system. To counter this, we have the IGN 102 tablets. Just never forget to throw them in any liquid for drinking or eating. And so, the spacesuits, Griff Rift, silent up until now, intervened. We will have one advantage. In case of danger? Iviza inclined her head, throwing a sidelong glance at Chedi Dan. You guessed correctly. The suit succumbs neither to knife, bullet, nor pyrobeam, Rift confirmed. But the head, the most valuable part of the body, does succumb without a helmet, rebutted Rotis cheerfully. Chedi Dan stared closely at Rotis, as though surprised at her revival. Indeed, the restrained, slightly strict leader of the expedition now, on the eve of the test, seemed to have become different. But what about Chedi's plan? General Atoll asked. It will have to be carried out later after acclimatization, said Rotis. Chedi tightened her lips and turned to the large map of Tormance, stretched over the entrance to the round hall. Chedi, just now came into my head. Iviza Tanit called to her, "You were sensitive to the theater staged by Rotis and Oladez. But don't you think that the intention to merge with the people of Yan Yak, disguising yourself as a girl of Tormance, also contains an element of deception? Looking with strangers' eyes at what is open to ye as a natural Tormanzian, isn't this spying?" Yes. No, I imagined it from the other side. Just to get closer to them, living the same life, experiencing the same difficulties and joys, troubles and dangers, but having the opportunity at any moment to return to your own, possessing the might of a human of the EMH, and the happiness of return to the beautiful world of Earth? Iviza pressed on. Chedi looked back at Rotis out of a long-standing habit of gauging the reaction of her idol, but Rotis' green eyes looked at her seriously and impenetrably. There is duality, Chedi began, and I was thinking about something more important. For whom? Iviza was merciless as a researcher. For us. And for them, Chedi pointed to the map of Tormance. There will be no harm. After all, we are doing this so as not to make a mistake, to find out how and with what we can help. First you need to find out if you should, said Griff Rift. It may turn out. A blinding ray of red light flashed outside the window of direct observation. The spaceship shook. Genital instantly disappeared into the elevator, and Griff Rift and Div Symbol rushed to the standby positions of the pilot station. Another flash, another slight shudder of the body of the dark flame. The included sound receivers brought a monstrous roar that drowned out the monotonous scream of a dissected atmosphere. The crew ran to their emergency detail posts and stood ready over their instruments, not yet aware of what had happened. The spaceship continued to race through the darkness on the night side of the planet. They were no more than half an hour from the Terminator. The silver bells rang a signal of no danger. Rift and Symbol descended from the cockpit, and Genetao from the armor protection post. What was it? An attack? Rotis met them. Clearly, Griff Rift nodded somberly. They probably fired missiles. Anticipating such a possibility, Genetao and I kept the external reflective field activated, although it causes a terrible noise in the atmosphere. The starship has not received the slightest damage. How will we answer? We won't, said Rotis firmly. We will make it look as if we noticed nothing. They know from the flashes that they hit both times and will be convinced of the complete invulnerability of our ship. I am certain that there will be no more attempts. That may be so, Griff Rift agreed, but we will leave the field. Let it howl rather than risk exposing everyone to cowardly treachery. Now I am even more behind the suits, said Iviza. And with NP helmets, Rift said. No helmets needed, retorted Rotis. Or there will be no contact with the inhabitants of the planet, and our mission will bring no significant benefits. This risk will have to be accepted. The helmets are hardly likely to provide reliable protection, Iviza Tanit shrugged her superb shoulders. Attacks on the spaceship were not repeated. The dark flame moved into high orbit and shut down the engines. The ship did not stop preparing for the landing for a minute. Biological filters were most carefully fitted onto the noses, mouths, and ears of the 7 paratroopers. Personal SDP satellite robots were tuned to individual biocurrents. The first letters of the Latin words, servant, defender, porter, designated the purpose of the machines. The suits, as usual, required the greatest care. They were manufactured by a special institute from the thinnest layers of a molecularly reconstructed metal, insulated with a lining that does not irritate the skin. Despite the incredible, for techniques even of the recent past, strength and heat resistance, the thickness of the spacesuit was measured in fractions of a millimeter, and it did not differ outwardly from the thinnest gymnastic suit with a high collar, tightly fitting the whole body. A man dressed in such a suit looked like a metal statue, only flexible, lively, and warm. Choosing the colors of the spacesuits, Oladez tried to present each participant in the landing, especially the women, the most effectively. Phi Rotis, without hesitation, chose black with a blue tint, the color of the raven wing, which was very suitable for her black hair, hard features, and green eyes. Eviza asked to give the medal a silver-green color of willow leaf. She decided not to change the dark red shade of her hair and her topaz cat's eyes. The black belt and black collar trim highlighted the flames of her hair even more sharply. Chadidan chose ash blue, with the deep tint of the Earth's sky and a silver trim, and Tavisa, without thinking twice, took a dark garnet with a pink belt, in harmony with her olive skin and solemn brown eyes. The men wanted to wear identical gray spacesuits, but, obeying the insistence of the women, they chose metal armor of more beautiful color combinations. Phi Rotis examined the faces of her companions, thoughtfully. They looked pale compared to the swarthy inhabitants of the planet Yanyak, and she advised everyone to take tanning pills. "Maybe we should change the color of our eyes, make them impenetrably black to match the Tormansians?" asked Eviza. "No, why?" objected Rotis. "Let them be as they are, but make them even brighter." "Is that possible, Eviza? A few years ago, star-shone eyes were in fashion." "Provided I have 4 days for a series of chemical stimulations." "Ye will have 4 days, give us all radiant eyes resembling stars, and let the Earthling be seen from afar in any crowd." "I wonder what kind of eyes our distant ancestors loved the most, when they still did not have the ability to change their color at will," said Oladez. "Phi knows, for example, the tastes of EDW. If we talk about the tastes of that era, then they were very volatile, unclear, and unreasonable. But for some reason in those days, beauty was required, predominantly from women. Works of literature, photos, films enumerate feminine virtues and hardly speak of masculine ones. Were our distant sisters so shamefully indiscriminate? Ola was indignant. The inheritance of millennia of the military patriarchy, and abundance of the lords so interesting to ye. Rotis smiled, but back to the eyes. In the first place were mine, pure green eyes, and this is quite natural according to the biological laws of health and strength. And which of us is in second place? Chedi, blue or violet, bright shade. Farther down the line were gray, then brown and cyan. Topaz eyes, like those of Eviza, or golden, like those of Oya, were very rare and therefore highly valued, but they were considered ominous because they looked like the eyes of predatory animals, cats, tigers, eagles. "Was there any criterion for men?" asked Eviza. "They apparently did not have green eyes, judging by the literature, or blue either," Rotis shrugged. "Most often referred to as gray as steel, or blue as ice. A sign of strong, iron-willed natures, real men, subjugating others, always ready to use their fists or weapons. On these grounds, we should be afraid of the Griff Rift and Vir Noreen," Eviza laughed. "But if Griff Rift is truly a commander, then Vir Noreen is too soft, even for a man of the EMH," objected Oyadez. "Eyes are eyes, but you still have to put on this metal," Eviza Tanit sighed, "and part for a long time with the feeling of your skin." And she ran a palm over her shoulder and bare arm, with the eternal gesture of a person thoroughly trained in bodily care since childhood. "Let us begin. Who will assist? Ye, Ola, and Nea." "Without Nea, no way," answered Oladez. "Then call her." And Phi Rotis took the first step over the threshold, into the chamber of biological control. The dressing process was long and unpleasant. A considerable time passed before all 7 gathered in the round hall. Sheridan had never before worn a spacesuit and had to gradually get used to the feeling of double skin. She could not take her eyes off Phirotis. Such an embodiment of the beauty of a strong female body, she appeared in her black armor, shading the pallor of her face and the transparency of her green eyes. Onto the belts of each, an oval box for the destruction of metabolic products was fastened. On their shoulders, strips of video recorders and triangular mirrors of circular visibility glittered. They wore a second signal bracelet on their right hands to communicate with the ship through a personal robot, and in the hollow between the collarbones, they placed an air blower cylinder. From time to time, an air wave ran between the body and the suit from the shoulders to the feet, creating the pleasant sensation of light massage. Air blew out through valves on the heels, and from the side it seemed as if powerful muscles were rolling in a metal body. Phirotis looked around her comrades, so strangely distant and inaccessible in the cold brilliance of the tight metal. "And will ye appear before the Tormancians like this?" came the voice of the Griffrift. Rhoda suddenly realized what was bothering her. Out of the question, she turned to the rift. "We women will wear the usual short skirts of the tropical zone with a pelerine." "Perhaps a shirt would be better, like the Tormanzian women," Tavisa asked, shy of the revealing openness of the spacesuit. "Let's try. Maybe they will be more convenient," Rhoda agreed. "And I'm for a tropical suit for the men," said Vir Noreen. "Shorts are good, but a sleeveless shirt will draw attention to your metallic arms," Griffrift objected. "Tormancian shirts are more convenient for the men as well. How strange it is that on Tormance, on the streets and in the homes, people wrap themselves in clothes. But on the stages, in the huge halls of public shows or in television shows, they are barely dressed," said Oladez. "Indeed, this is an absurd contradiction, one of many that stands ahead for us to resolve," said Rhodus. "It might be that because Tormancians are usually dressed from head to toe that this kind of spectacle is therefore attractive to them," Chetty guessed. This simple and probable explanation is probably erroneous. Judging by the laws of the psyche, everything is much more complicated, Rhodus concluded the discussion. After the first session of magnetic stimulation conducted by Avisa, the paratroopers dispersed, feeling unusually connected and alienated in the armor. They had to get used to it in the days remaining before landing. The thinnest metal film, which essentially did not constrain movement at all, became an invisible wall between them and those remaining on the ship. Everything seemingly remained the same, but there was no unanimous "we" in the discussion of immediate plans. They and we had arisen. The signal of readiness for the starship from the main observatory of the Guardians of the Sky was followed by an indication of the landing site. Dark Flame was supposed to sit down on a wide, gently sloping cape on the southern shore of the Equatorial Sea, about 300 kilometers from the capital. Enlarged photographs of this place showed a dull rampart, overgrown with tall, dark shrubs, wedged into the gray-green sea. Both the terrain and the sea seemed deserted, which caused concern among those remaining in the starship. Deserted, the main condition for landing the DBS. "We warned the Council of the Four," Griffrift reminded his comrades. "They could have chosen a place closer to the city," said Oladez. "Anyway, they aren't letting us all leave the ship." "You forget, Ola," said Rhodus cheerlessly. "Near the city, it would be very difficult to keep the curious at bay. And here, they will secure the area, and none of the inhabitants of Tormance will approach our ship." "They will approach. I'll take care of it." Griffrift intervened with unexpected fervor. "I will break through the shrubbery with a shielding corridor that will open with a sound password. I'll transfer the entry point to Phi through video beam, and ye can send guests to us, desired, of course." "There will also be undesired ones," said Rhodus. "No doubt. Nea will replace Atel, and we will repel any attempt. It is necessary to be on the alert. After failing with the missiles, they will try something else. Not before they are convinced that the second spaceship I spoke of will not come. Until then, ye will be safe. 3 to 4 months, perhaps more." "Like us," Rhodus added, quieter. Griffrift put his hand on her shoulder in warm black metal and looked into her sad and fearless eyes. "Ye yourself determined the time period for your return to the ship, Rhodus, and it's better to shorten rather than lengthen it. I understand your concern, Rift. What if ye meet a wall of death, absolute misunderstanding, and ye aren't able to break through it? Is further stay justified? It's too big a risk." I can't believe that the knowledge of Earth can be rejected. After all, this is the door to an infinite and clear future from their life. Short, painful, and, I am afraid to say, dark, retorted Rhodus. The sense of necessity of sacrifice, the most archaic in man, passing through all religions in the history of ancient societies. To placate an unknown force, to assuage a deity, to give longevity to a fragile fate. From the burial of people on altars before the battle, hunting, for the harvest or the foundation of buildings, from the colossal hecatombs of leaders, kings, pharaohs, to unimaginable brutality in the name of insane political and religious ideas, ethnic hatred. But we, who have cognized measure, the creators of the great protective devices of society for the elimination of grief and sacrifice, have we not yet parted with this ancient trait of the psyche? Rhodus affectionately ran her fingers through Griff's hair. If we invade Tormance's life using ancient methods, the clash of power with power, if we descend to the level of their ideas about life and dreams, Rhodus fell silent. Thus, we accept the need for sacrifice. Is it so? It is so, Rift. As soon as Rhodus entered her cabin, her signal bracelet flashed. Chetty Don, who for some time avoided meeting her in private, asked permission to come. Apparently, I'm very stupid, Chetty said, barely having crossed the threshold. I know so little about the great complexity of life. Rhodus lightly squeezed the girl's hot hands, encompassed at the wrists with the silver rings of the spacesuit, admiring her face that darkened in the frame of her ash-brown hair. No need to torment yourself, Chetty. The main thing is always and everywhere, never to commit an act dictated by an erroneous opinion. Who has not become confused by seemingly insoluble contradictions? Even the gods of ancient beliefs were subject to this. Only nature has unlimited cruelty enough to solve contradictions by blind experiment at the expense of all living things. They sat on the sofa. Chetty looked inquiringly at Rhodus. Tell me about the theory of Inferno, she asked after some hesitation, and hastily added, It is very important for me to know. Rhodus walked thoughtfully through the cabin and, stopping at the shelves of the micro-library, ran her fingers along the green plates of the coded names. The theory of infernality, so they have said for a long time. In fact, this is not a theory, but a set of statistical observations on our Earth about the elemental laws of life, and especially human society. Inferno, from the Latin word of the lower regions underground, it meant hell. A magnificent poem has come down to us from Dante, who, although he wrote only a political satire, by his imagination created a dark picture of multi-stage inferno. He explained the previously terrible essence of the name Inferno, which had been understandable only to occultists, and of its hopelessness. The inscription, Abandon hope, all ye who enter here, on the gates of hell reflected the main property of this monastery of torment, invented by people. This intuitive presentiment of the true background of historical development of human society, in the evolution of all life on Earth as a terrible path of grief and death, was measured and taken into account with the advent of electronic machines. The notorious natural selection of nature appeared as the most vivid expression of infernality, a method to achieve improvement blindly, as in a game, throwing dice countless times. But behind every throw, there are millions of lives who died in misery and hopelessness. Cruel selection formed and directed evolution along the path of improving the organism in only one main direction: the greatest freedom, independence from the external environment. But this inevitably required an elevation in the intensity of feelings, even just nervous activity, and led to a mandatory increase in the amount of suffering on the path of life. In other words, this path led to hopelessness. There was a multiplication of the immature, hypertrophy of uniformity, like sand in the desert, violation of uniqueness and unrepeatable treasures by an incalculable repetition. Passing trillions of transformations from unknown sea creatures to a thinking organism, animal life spent billions of years of geological history in Inferno. Man, as a thinking creature, fell into a double inferno, for both the body and the soul. At first, it seemed to him that he would be saved from all life's adversities by fleeing into nature. So, fairy tales about the primeval paradise were created. When the structure of the human psyche became clearer, scientists determined that inferno for the soul is a primitive instinct, a captivity in which a person keeps himself, thinking that he preserves his personality. Some philosophers, speaking of the fatal invincibility of instincts, contributed to their development, and thereby made it harder to overcome inferno. Only the creation of conditions for the preponderance of not instinctive but self-improving specimens could help take a great step towards the elevation of social consciousness. Religious people began to preach that nature, contributing to the development of instincts, was from the embodiment of evil, long known under the name of Satan. Scientists objected, believing that the process of blind natural evolution was aimed at liberation from the external environment and, therefore, an exit from Inferno. With the development of powerful state apparatuses of authority and oppression, with the intensification of nationalism with tightly closed borders, Inferno began to be created also in society. They were so tangled up in both natural and social contradictions, until Marx formulated a simple and clear provision on the leap from the realm of necessity to the realm of freedom in the only possible way, the way of the reorganization of society. Studying the fascist dictatorships of the EDW, Efremov, philosopher and historian of the Fifth Period, formulated the principles of infernality, later developed in detail by my teacher. Efremov noticed the tendency of any imperfect social system to isolate itself, protecting its structure from contact with other systems in order to preserve itself. Naturally, only the privileged classes of this system, the oppressors, would strive to preserve the imperfect. First of all, they created the segregation of their people under any pretext, national, religious, in order to turn its life into a vicious circle of inferno, to separate from the rest of the world, so that communication could only go through the ruling group. Therefore, infernality was inevitably the work of their hands. Quite unexpectedly, the naive and religious teaching of Manichaeism actualized the existence of directed evil in the world. In fact, it was a completely material struggle for privileges, in a world where everything was lacking. Efremov warned mankind not to allow the world domination of the oligarchy, fascism, or state capitalism. Otherwise, the grave cover of the complete hopelessness of infernal existence under the fifth absolute power, armed with all the might of the terrible weapons of those times and no less killing science, would slam over our planet. Efremov's works, in the opinion of Kinruk, helped build a new world in the transition to the era of world reunification. By the way, it was Efremov who first noticed that the whole natural evolution of life on Earth is infernal. Subsequently, Kinruk wrote so vividly about the same thing. Rhodes habitually dialed the code, and a small square of the library screen lit up. The familiar appearance of Kinruk arose in the yellow depths, staring into the spectators with amazingly sharp and pale eyes. The scientist waved his hand and ducked out of sight, continuing to speak behind the scenes. And on the screen appeared the tired, pensive, and inspirational face of an old man with a square forehead and high-combed light gray hair. Kinruk explained that this was the ancient philosopher Aldous, who was previously thought to be the inventor of the marine signal light. It is difficult to decipher the names of peoples whose phonetics did not coincide with orthography. The pronunciation was lost in the following centuries, which especially affected the widely used in the EDW English language. Aldous, noticeably worried and suffocating from overt heart disease, said, "I take as an example a young man who had lost his beloved wife, just died from cancer. He did not yet feel that he was a victim of some special injustice, universal biological law, merciless, monstrous, and cynical, no less brutal than the fascist laws. This intolerable law says that a person must suffer, lose youth and strength, and die. It allowed the young man to be deprived of all the most precious things, and gave him neither safety nor protection, leaving him forever open to any blows dealt by fate from the shadow of the future. Man has always passionately dreamed of changing this law, refusing to be a biological loser in the game of fate, according to the rules established billions of years ago. Why should we accept our lot without a fight? Thousands of Einsteins in biology will help to get us out of this game. We refuse to bow our heads to the injustices of nature, to come to terms with it." Kinruk said, "It is difficult to articulate the concept of inferno for a person. See for how long people have understood its principles, and now." A model of a globe appeared on the screen, a multi-layer transparent spheroid illuminated from the inside. Each part of its surface was a tiny diorama that threw a stereoscopic image directly at the viewer, as if from an immense distance. Initially, the lower layers of the ball lit up, leaving the upper and transparent mute. Gradually, the projection rose higher to the surface. The history of the Earth, captured in geological strata, was clearly visible to the viewer. This regular demonstrative model was saturated with content unprecedented to Chetty. Kinrook announced that he had built a scheme of the evolution of animals according to Efremov. Each type of animal was adapted to certain living conditions, an ecological niche, as biologists had called it already since ancient times. The adaptation closed the way out of the niche, creating a separate center of Inferno until the species multiplied so much that it could no longer exist in the overpopulated niche. The more perfect the adaptation, the more individual species succeeded, the more terrible the consequent retribution. Different parts of the globe lit up and went out. Pictures of the terrible evolution of the animal world flickered. Thousands of clusters of crocodile-like amphibians swarmed in sticky silt in swamps and lagoons, lakes overflowing with salamanders, serpentine and lizard-like creatures that died in their millions in a meaningless struggle for existence. Turtles, gigantic dinosaurs, sea monsters, writhing in the bays, poisoned by decomposition, starving to death on depleted coasts. Higher up along the Earth's layers in geological time, then giant herds of animals. Inevitably, the development of the brain and feelings followed. Ever stronger became the fear of death, concern for offspring. Ever more perceptible, the suffering of devoured herbivores, in the dark world perception of which huge predators were supposed to resemble the demons and devils created subsequently by the human imagination. Their royal power, magnificent teeth and claws, inspiring admiration of their primal beauty, which had only one purpose: to tear, ravage, live flesh, crush bones. And no one and nothing could help. It was impossible to escape that vicious circle of infernality, swamp, steppe, or forest, in which the animal was born in the blind instinct of reproduction and conservation of species. And man, with his strong feelings, memory, ability to understand the future, soon realized that, from birth, like all earthly creatures, he was sentenced to death. The only question was the time of execution and the amount of suffering that would fall on the lot of precisely this individual. And the higher, the purer, the more noble a person was, the greater the measure of suffering would be granted to him by generous nature and social being, until the wisdom of people united in titanic efforts breaks this game of blind elemental forces, which had been going on for billions of years in this gigantic global inferno of the planet. That is why the first understanding of the infernality of life in the past carried with it so many mental breakdowns and suicides at the finest age, 18 to 20 years. I juxtaposed two passages from my teacher's lectures, said Phyrodes, and now the notorious theory of infernality is clear to ye. But for millions of years, on the faith of our yes ye answer no, Rhodus sang, paraphrasing one of her beloved ancient Russian poets. "Oh yes," exclaimed Chetty. "But could I learn something more about the trials that some historians subjected themselves to?" "Ye apparently know more about me than I thought," said Rhodus, reading her thoughts, "so ye can learn more." With these words, she took out a star-shaped mnemonics crystal, colloquially referred to as a starlet, and handed it to Chetty. "Infernality increased the inevitable suffering of life 100-fold, she said, creating people with weak nervous systems whose lives were even heavier, the first vicious circle. In periods of relative improvement in conditions, suffering waned, giving rise to indifferent egoists. With the transition of consciousness to the highest social level, we cease to become locked in personal suffering, but the passion for others expanded immensely. That is, compassion, concern for all, and the eradication of grief and misery all over the world that every hour concerns and worries each of us. If one is in Inferno, aware of it and the impossibility of getting out for an individual person due to the length of the process, then it only makes sense to aid its destruction. Therefore, helping others, doing good, creating the beautiful, spreading knowledge. Otherwise, what then is the point in life? A simple truth, which took a surprisingly long time to understand. Therefore, real revolutionaries of the spirit were rare in those ancient times. To imagine the measure of personal suffering of past times, we historians came up with a system of trials, conventionally called the steps of infernality. This is a series of not only physical, but also mental torment, designed so that we, studying the history of EDW, would become closer to the sensations of our ancestors. The motivation for their actions and prejudices would become clearer for distant millennia of brighter life for the descendants. Chetty Dawn tilted her head intently. "And you think that here, on Tormance, there is Inferno?" that the lid of all planetary oppression is slammed shut here because they have not reached. Their all-planetary oligarchy rose very quickly due to the homogeneity of the population and culture, Rodas explained. Chetty Don left, looking back at the motionless Phi Rodas, carried away by thoughts perhaps to the unknown planet below the ship or to the infinitely distant Earth. 2 hours later, Chetty appeared again, with flaming cheeks and lowered eyes. Without a word, she returned the starlet, took Rodas' outstretched hand, put it to her forehead and suddenly kissed it, whispering, "Forgive me for everything." She ran out of the cabin, still awkward in her spacesuit. Rodas watched her leaving, and hardly anyone from the crew of the starship could have imagined so much maternal kindness on the face of the expedition leader. The impression left by the recently watched starlet had stirred something up in Chetty, touching on some ancient instincts. In her memory, what she saw floated and came out with painful sharpness, no matter how much Chetty wanted to forget it as quickly as possible. Knowing the many similar stories from ancient books and films about the past, Chetty detachedly imagined the cruelty of former times. The resistance of the heroes was encouraging, and the very description of their misadventures even left a vaguely pleasant sense of security, the impossibility of a similar arbitrariness of fate with either Chetty herself or with anyone else from the whole multitude of people on Earth. A psychology teacher had explained at school that in ancient times, when there were many hungry and poor people, the well-fed and wealthy loved to read books and watch films about the poor, dying of hunger, the oppressed and humiliated, in order to better experience their secure and quiet life. Most sentimental books about flawed and unhappy people and, as an antithesis to them, about monumentally successful heroes and beauties, were created in the unstable, disturbing time of the EDW. Then people, foreseeing the inevitability of formidable upheavals in the life of mankind, were pleased with every work of art that could give a precious feeling of at least temporary security. Let this happen to others, but not to me. Chetty, like everyone else, had been through hardening with physical difficulties, worked in hospitals of serious illnesses, relapses of upset heredity, or very serious injuries with frequent cases of euthanasia, a sentence of easy death, no matter how high the level of development of society. But all this was a natural necessity of life, understandable, overcome by wisdom and psychic hardening, every minute feeling the unity of life with the general spiritual stream of humanity, striving for an ever higher future. For them, it was not necessary to believe, as in the bygone days, so realistically and visibly, it stood before the one going back into the past. But what Chetty saw in Rodas' starlets did not at all resemble the grief of EMH life. So naked were the loneliness and helplessness of a person who was forcibly divorced from everything interesting, bright, and precious, that a feeling of endless longing was intrusively implanted into the soul against the will of Chetty. The humiliation and torment that this lonely, torn creature was subjected to returned a person of the EMH to a primitive rage mixed with the bitterness of powerlessness, seemingly unthinkable for a person of Earth. Through the trials of 5 Rodas, Chetty plunged into the atmosphere of stifling, senseless cruelty and enmity of bygone centuries. The proud steel dignity of the EMH woman did not break under the weight of psychological pressure, perhaps because Phi Rodas was in front of her, the personification of everything that Chetty herself aspired to. The young researcher of man and society was ashamed, recalling how on a distant Earth she had repeatedly questioned the need for complex protective systems of a communist society. The people of the Earth, from generation to generation, had spent tremendous material means and forces on these systems. Now Chetty knew that, despite the inevitable increase in kindness, compassion, and tenderness, from the sum of the experience of millions of years of infernal suffering accumulated in gene memory, it was always possible for people to appear with an archaic understanding of valor, with a wild desire for power over people, to exalt themselves through humiliation of others. One rabid dog can bite and put hundreds of people in mortal danger. So a person with a twisted psychology is able to inflict terrible disasters in a kind, unsuspecting environment until a world, long having forgotten about its previous social dangers, is able to isolate and transform it. That is why the organization of PSOI, psychological supervision, working together with the LTI, the lattice transformation of the individual, was so complex and was continuously being improved by the Council of Honor and Right. Only a complete analogy with the PEC, the protection of the electronic communications of a spacecraft, was more complicated and diverse. Understanding for the first time the role of the PSOI reassured and encouraged Chetty. It was as if the motherly vigilant care of humanity on Earth had reached its mighty arm here, through the volutions of Shakti and Tamas. Taking a deep breath, the girl ceased to feel the metal armor and fell into her first calm sleep since the approach of Tormance had begun.